I kept my eyes on my plate for the rest of the evening, not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to look to understand what was happening. Everything had already arranged itself into a quiet pattern that no one else at that table seemed to see. Daniel was talking about work, something about a new contract, his voice steady, confident, the same voice I had heard since he was a boy, asking for help with homework, asking if I would stay up just a little longer. Now he sat there across from me, unaware that the foundation beneath his life had already begun to shift. Emily nodded at the right moments, her smile measured, her hand resting lightly on the table, every movement controlled, as if she had rehearsed this version of herself long before tonight. Richard finally looked up once our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, I saw it, not guilt, not even fear, but something closer to calculation, as if he was trying to measure how much I knew and what I might do. With it, I gave him nothing in return, just a small, polite smile, the kind you offer a stranger in a grocery store aisle, something distant, something forgettable. The conversation moved on. Dessert was served, a pie I had made that afternoon from scratch out of habit. More than anything else, I watched them eat it, compliment it, thank me, in the same casual tone people use when they expect something to always be there. I wondered when exactly I had become part of the background of my own life. After dinner, Emily stood up and began clearing plates. Without asking, she moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. I followed a few minutes later, not to help, but to observe. She stood at the sink rinsing dishes, her shoulders relaxed. She did not turn around. When she spoke, "You are very quiet tonight, Margaret," her voice light, almost playful. I dried my hands slowly with a towel and leaned against the counter. "I have learned that not everything needs to be said right away," I replied. She let out a small laugh, as if we were sharing some private understanding. "You always did know how to keep things to yourself," she said, and for a moment there was something beneath her words, something sharper, something that confirmed what I had already accepted. This was not an accident, not a moment of weakness. This had been unfolding quietly, deliberately, over time. I looked at the back door, the glass reflecting both of us standing in that kitchen, one woman who believed she had taken something, and another who had already decided what would be taken in return. Upstairs, my bedroom felt different that night, not unfamiliar but distant, like a place I had once lived in but no longer belonged to. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and took out a small notebook, something I had not used in years. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to write, not feelings, not questions, just facts, dates, times, small details that no one else would think to remember. The receipt, the reflection in the glass, the way his voice changed when he spoke her name. I wrote everything down slowly, carefully, as if I was preparing something important, because I was. By the time I closed the notebook, I felt a calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from clarity. They thought this was still their secret. They thought they were still in control, but they had already stepped into a story they did not understand. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in the middle of the night, because I finally knew exactly what I was going to do next. The next morning arrived the same way it always had, sunlight filtering through the curtains, the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a car passing by. Nothing in the world outside had changed, and yet everything inside my home felt subtly rearranged. I moved through my routine without hesitation. I made coffee, measured 2 cups of water like I had done for decades, even though I knew only one would be used. Now I poured it anyway and set the second cup across from mine at the kitchen table, an old habit that no longer needed a reason. I sat there for a moment, watching the steam rise, thinking about how many mornings I had spent believing this life was stable, that the people in it were anchored by something deeper than convenience. I did not feel anger, not in the way people expect. It was quieter than that, more precise, like a line being drawn where there had never been one before. Richard came downstairs a few minutes later, his steps slow, deliberate. He greeted me the same way he always did, a soft good morning, as if nothing had shifted, as if the night before had not happened. I nodded and slid his cup toward him. He hesitated for a second before sitting down. I noticed everything, the way he avoided my eyes, the way he stirred his coffee longer than necessary, the way silence stretched between us, not empty, but full of things neither of us intended to say. "You have an appointment today?" he finally asked, his voice neutral. I took a sip of my coffee before answering. "Yes," I said, "just a small one downtown." He nodded again, relieved perhaps that there was something ordinary to hold on to, something that did not require explanation. What he did not ask, and what I did not offer, was the nature of that appointment, because for the first time in many years I was doing something entirely for myself. After he left the house, I cleared the table slowly, rinsed the cups, and placed them back in their usual spots. Nothing about my movements was rushed. I wanted everything to feel intentional. I went upstairs dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress, something appropriate, something that would not draw attention. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, not searching for emotion, but for certainty, and I found it there in the stillness of my own reflection. The drive into town took about 20 minutes. The roads familiar, the traffic light. I had stopped it countless times, now feeling like part of a different life altogether. I parked in front of a modest office building and sat in the car for a few seconds before stepping out, not to gather courage, but to acknowledge the moment. This was the point where observation would turn into action. Inside the building, the air was cool. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to take a seat. I did so, folding my hands neatly in my lap, as if I were waiting for something routine, something expected. When my name was called, I stood up and followed her down a quiet hallway into a small office where a man in a gray suit rose to greet me. "Margaret Collins," he said, extending his hand. "It is nice to meet you." I shook his hand firmly and took the seat across from his desk. Everything about the room was orderly, files stacked neatly, a pen placed exactly at the center of the desk, a space designed for clarity and decisions. I reached into my bag and placed my notebook in front of me along with a few carefully folded documents I had brought from home. "I would like to review my will," I said, my voice steady and even. And then, after a brief pause, I added, "and I would like to make some changes." He nodded without surprise, as if he had heard similar requests many times before. But this was not a routine adjustment. This was the beginning of something deliberate, something final. I opened the notebook to the first page and began to speak calmly, clearly outlining the facts, not the emotions, not the betrayal, just the truth as it existed in precise detail, because I understood now that power did not come from confrontation, it came from preparation. And as I sat there in that quiet office, I realized that for the first time since that whisper at the dinner table, everything was exactly where it needed to be. The meeting lasted less than an hour, but by the time I walked out of that office, the shape of my life had already changed in ways no one else could see. The lawyer had listened carefully, taking notes only when necessary, asking questions that were precise and measured. He did not react to the details I shared, not to the timeline, not to the names, not even to the quiet certainty in my voice when I explained what I needed done. There was a professionalism in the way he handled everything that I appreciated. It allowed me to speak without interruption, without judgment, as if this was simply another matter to be arranged, another structure to be corrected. When we reached the final point, I slid the last document across his desk, a property record, the house, the one I had lived in for over 4 decades, the one everyone assumed would remain exactly as it was. He glanced at it briefly and then back at me. "Do you want this included in the revision?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment before answering yes, but with conditions. I explained them slowly, each one deliberate, each one designed not out of anger, but out of clarity. If certain actions were confirmed, if certain lines were crossed, then ownership would transfer in a way no one in my family would expect. He nodded again, making notes, adjusting the language to ensure there would be no confusion, no loopholes, no easy way around what I was putting in place. When everything was finished, he gathered the papers neatly and told me they would be ready for signature within 2 days. I thanked him, stood up, and left without looking back. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just exact, like something had settled into its proper position. I drove home the same route as before, passing the same streets, the same shops, the same people moving through their ordinary lives. And for a brief moment, I wondered how many of them were carrying quiet truths of their own, how many were sitting at tables pretending not to see what was right in front of them. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Richard's car was already there, which meant he had come home early. Something he rarely did. I stepped inside and found him in the living room, sitting in his usual chair, the television on, but muted. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "You are back early," he said. I set my keys down on the table and removed my coat. "Just a short appointment," I replied. He studied me for a moment, as if searching for something beneath the surface, something that would confirm or deny whatever thoughts had been forming in his mind. But I gave him nothing. The same calm, the same steady presence I had carried with me all day. Emily appeared in the doorway a second later, her timing almost too perfect. She leaned casually against the frame, her arms crossed. "You look tired, Margaret," she said, her voice soft but edged with something else. I met her gaze without hesitation. "I feel very clear," I answered, and for a brief second something flickered in her expression, not fear, not yet, but a small shift, a recognition that something had changed, even if She could not yet name it. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. Daniel talked less, Richard barely spoke, and Emily filled the silence with light conversation that felt carefully placed like decorations covering something unfinished. I responded when necessary, nodded when expected, but mostly I observed. I noticed how often they looked at each other, how quickly their conversation stopped when I entered the room, how the air seemed to adjust around me as if I had become an unexpected variable in a plan that had once been simple. Later that night, as I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom, I could hear their voices downstairs, low and indistinct. I did not move closer. I did not need to. The details no longer mattered in the same way they once might have. What mattered was already in motion. Upstairs on my desk, the notebook remained open beside an empty space where new documents would soon be placed. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that this was no longer about what they had done. It was about what I would choose to do next, and that choice was no longer uncertain. 2 days passed without anything unusual happening, and that was exactly what made it useful. Nothing disrupted the rhythm of the house, nothing forced a confrontation. Everything continued, as if the quiet tension had settled into something permanent. Richard left in the mornings at the same time, Daniel followed shortly after, and Emily stayed behind, just long enough to create the illusion of routine. Before stepping out for her own day, I began to notice the pattern more clearly. Now the timing of their movements, the small overlaps that seemed accidental, but were anything. But on the second afternoon, I remained in the house. Instead of going out, I moved slowly through each room, not searching for anything specific, but allowing the space to reveal what it already held. The living room still carried the faint scent of his cologne. The kitchen counters were spotless except for a single glass left near the sink, not quite where it should have been. I stood there for a moment looking at it before rinsing it and placing it back in the cabinet exactly where it belonged. Everything had its place, and I intended to keep it that way. Later that evening, Emily returned earlier than usual, her steps lighter, her expression composed. She greeted me with a brief smile, as if nothing existed beneath the surface. "Margaret," she said, "I was thinking we should have another family dinner this weekend, something simple. Just us." I looked at her for a moment, noting the ease in her voice, the confidence that suggested she believed the situation was still under her control, that she was guiding the direction of things. I folded a dish towel carefully and set it down. "That sounds like a good idea," I replied. She nodded, satisfied, as if she had just secured something important, but she did not realize that she had just offered me exactly what I needed, a setting, a moment, a stage that would not need to be forced. That night I sat at my desk again, the notebook open beside the space where the finalized documents now rested. I had picked them up earlier that day without informing anyone. The pages were clean, precise, every condition clearly written, every outcome carefully structured. I read through them once more, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what they represented. This was no longer observation, this was intention. I placed the documents back into their folder and closed it gently. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty, but controlled. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of voices, Emily and Richard speaking in low tones, their words indistinct, but their presence unmistakable. I did not move to listen. I did not need confirmation anymore. What I needed was timing, and that had just been given to me. The following morning at breakfast, I mentioned the dinner casually, as if it were simply another gathering. Daniel seemed pleased. He always valued these moments, unaware of what rested beneath them. Richard gave a brief nod, his attention on his coffee. Emily smiled across the table, her expression calm but watchful, as if she was measuring something I could not yet see. I met her gaze and returned the same calm. In that moment, there was an understanding between us, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present. She believed she was preparing for something of her own. And so was I. The difference was that she still thought the story belonged to her. But by the end of that dinner, it would be clear that it never had. The day of the dinner arrived without announcement. No one marked it as important. No one acknowledged the weight it carried. But I felt it in the way the house held its silence. That morning, everything seemed slightly more deliberate. I woke earlier than usual, not out of restlessness, but out of readiness, the kind that settles in when a decision has already been made, and all that remains is its execution. I moved through the kitchen, preparing the meal with the same care I always had, measuring ingredients, setting the table, polishing the silverware until it reflected the soft light above it. Nothing about my actions suggested anything unusual, and that was exactly the point. Every detail needed to feel familiar, predictable, safe. By the time the afternoon turned into evening, the house carried the scent of roasted herbs and warm bread, a scene anyone would recognize as comfort. Daniel arrived first, his voice filling the hallway with easy warmth. He hugged me the same way he always did, unaware of the distance that had quietly formed around him. "You always make it feel like home, Mom," he said, and I smiled gently, because I knew he believed that. Emily followed shortly after, her presence calm, controlled. She placed her hand lightly on his arm as they stepped inside, her eyes moving quickly across the room, taking in the table, the arrangement, the atmosphere, as if she was checking for something I had not given her anything to find. Richard was the last to enter, his steps slower, his expression guarded. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I saw it again, that quiet calculation, that question he could not ask without revealing too much. I greeted him the same way I always had, nothing more, nothing less. We sat down together, the four of us, the table between us filled with food. Conversation began easily. Daniel spoke about work, Emily added small details at the right moments. Richard remained mostly quiet, his attention divided between his plate and the spaces between our words. I listened, I nodded, I allowed the evening to unfold exactly as they expected it to. No raised voices, no tension, no visible cracks, just the steady rhythm of a family dinner that appeared intact. Halfway through the meal, Emily leaned back slightly, her hand resting over her stomach, a gesture subtle but intentional. I noticed it immediately. So did Richard, though he pretended not to. Daniel continued speaking, unaware, and then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "There is something we should probably talk about soon," she said, not looking at me directly, but not avoiding me either. The words hung in the air just long enough to shift the atmosphere without breaking it. I placed my fork down, carefully aligning it with the edge of my plate, and lifted my gaze to meet hers. "I agree," I said, my voice even and composed. "There are a few things that should be addressed." Richard shifted in his seat. Daniel glanced between us, his expression confused, as if he had just realized he had stepped into a conversation he did not understand. Emily held my gaze a moment longer, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps expecting uncertainty, but she found neither. What she found instead was something she had not prepared for, a stillness that did not retreat, a calm that did not bend. The room grew quieter, not empty, but waiting, as if it understood that something had already begun and could no longer be stopped. I reached for the glass of water beside me, took a small measured sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been before, and in that simple movement I felt the final piece settle into place, not with force, not with noise, but with certainty. They believed this moment belonged to them, that they were guiding it, shaping it, revealing it, but they had already stepped into a structure they did not see, and by the time they realized that, the outcome would no longer be theirs to control. No one spoke for a few seconds after my words settled into the space between us. It was not silence in the usual sense, it was heavier, more deliberate, as if each person at the table was waiting for someone else to define what had just happened. Daniel looked from Emily to me, his brow slightly furrowed, as though he had missed something important, something everyone else seemed to understand, but had not yet explained. "What do you mean?" he asked finally, his voice uncertain. Emily shifted in her chair, her hand still resting lightly where it had been before, her expression composed, but I noticed the subtle change in her posture, the way her shoulders drew back just slightly, as if preparing to step forward into something she believed she controlled. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said softly, turning toward him, her tone gentle, carefully measured. "There is something I have been meaning to share with everyone." Richard exhaled quietly, not a sigh, not quite a reaction, but enough for me to register it. His gaze dropped to the table, as if the wood grain offered him something safer than the truth unfolding in front of him. I reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair earlier that evening, moving slowly, not to draw attention, but to ensure that every movement remained intentional. Daniel's eyes followed my hand. "What is that?" he asked. I opened the folder without answering. Immediately, the sound of paper shifting seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the room. "Just some documents," I said calmly, "things I thought we might need to discuss together." Emily's gaze sharpened slightly. She had not expected this. "Not here, not now." I could see the calculation beginning again behind her eyes, trying to adjust, trying to regain balance. But the rhythm had already shifted. She no longer controlled the timing. I placed the first document on the table and turned it slightly so that Daniel could see it. It was simple, clear, nothing dramatic, just a statement of revisions to my will. His confusion deepened. "Mom, why are we talking about this now?" he asked. "Because timing matters," I replied quietly, "and because some decisions should not be delayed." Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Margaret, this is not really the moment," she said, her voice still polite, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. I met her gaze directly for the first time. That evening, I believe it is exactly the moment I said. Daniel looked between us again, his expression tightening. What is going on? He asked. Emily turned toward him, now her composure shifting into something more urgent. I was going to explain, she said quickly. But I did not look at her. I kept my focus on Daniel instead. There are things you deserve to understand, I said. And then, after a brief pause, I added, before they are explained in a way that leaves out the parts that matter. The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard shifted again, his hand tightening slightly around his glass. But he still said nothing. Emily's control was slipping, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in small ways. The way her voice had risen just a fraction, the way her hand no longer rested as easily as before. I placed another document beside the first one, this one outlining conditions, clearly written, structured in a way that left no room for interpretation. Daniel leaned forward, reading quickly, his eyes scanning the page, his confusion slowly giving way to something else, something closer to realization. Mom, what is this? He asked, his voice quieter now. I folded my hands together on the table and looked at him steadily. It is clarity, I said simply, and in that moment I could see it happening, the shift, the recognition, the first crack in the version of reality that had been carefully maintained until now. Emily sat very still across from me, no longer guiding the moment, no longer shaping the narrative. She had stepped into a space she thought she understood, but it was no longer hers to define, and for the first time since all of this began, the truth was no longer waiting in silence. It was sitting openly at the table where no one could ignore it any longer. Daniel read the page a second time, slower, now his eyes no longer moving quickly across the lines, but stopping at certain phrases as if they carried more weight than he expected. I watched the shift happen in real time, the way confusion turned into something heavier, something that required him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the room he was sitting in. Mom, he said again, but this time my name sounded different, not just a question but a request for something solid, something certain. I held his gaze steady. There are conditions in place, I said quietly, conditions that protect what I have built and define what happens when trust is broken. Emily straightened in her chair, her composure tightening again, as if she was trying to reclaim ground that had already been lost. Margaret, this is unnecessary, she said, her voice controlled but sharper than before. We can talk about this privately later. I did not look at her when I answered. I believe everything that matters should be clear to everyone involved, I replied. Daniel turned toward her now, his expression searching. What is she talking about? He asked. Emily hesitated, just for a moment, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching for it. There is nothing to worry about, she said quickly. It is just a misunderstanding, something we were going to explain. I reached into the folder again and placed one final document on the table, this one thinner, simpler, but far more direct. Richard's hand tightened around his glass, his knuckles paling slightly, though he still did not speak. Daniel looked down at the page and read silently, his lips pressing together as he reached the final line. His head lifted slowly, his eyes moving from the document to Emily and then to Richard. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but no longer uncertain. Is this true? He asked. The question did not need clarification. It hung in the air, complete on its own. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came immediately. The certainty she had carried for so long had finally met something it could not move around. Richard shifted again, his silence now louder than anything he could have said. I did not intervene. I did not explain. I allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Daniel looked back at me, his expression no longer confused, but clear in a way that carried its own weight. How long have you known? He asked. Long enough, I answered, and that was all I offered, because the exact timing no longer mattered. What mattered was what had been set into motion before this dinner ever began. Emily's voice returned, softer now, but strained. Margaret, we did not want to hurt anyone, she said. I met her gaze evenly, and for the first time I saw something real there, not control, not calculation, but the beginning of understanding. You assumed you would not be seen, I said quietly, and that assumption was your mistake. The room fell still again, but this time it was different. There was no illusion left, no careful balance to maintain. Everything had shifted into place. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between them, the weight of what he now understood settling over him. Richard finally spoke, his voice low, almost distant. We can fix this, he said. But even as he said it, the words sounded uncertain, as if he already knew they no longer applied. I closed the folder gently, placing my hand over it for a moment before standing up. There is nothing to fix, I said calmly, only things to accept. I stepped away from the table, not in anger, not in haste, But with the quiet certainty that had carried me through every step of this process, I paused briefly at the doorway, not to look back, but to let the silence behind me settle into what it had become. They had believed I was the one being left behind, the one unaware, the one without power, but they had misunderstood something essential. I had never lost my place in this house. I had simply allowed them to reveal theirs.